Crime Documentary presents. In the darkest corners of America's criminal history lies a story so chilling, so disturbing, that it has been etched into the minds of all who dared to uncover it. This is not a tale for the faint of heart. It is the blood-soaked journey of a man who came to be known as the Vampire of Sacramento. Unlike any killer before him, his crimes shocked even seasoned investigators, leaving behind a trail of horror that still makes people shiver decades later. Tonight, we pull you deep into the nightmare that was Richard Trenton Chase, America's real-life cannibal killer. Richard Trenton Chase was not born into a world of blood and terror, but into a home that carried cracks deep enough to shape his dark future. He came into the world in 1950 in Sacramento, California, a seemingly ordinary boy in an ordinary neighborhood. Yet beneath the surface his life would grow to be anything but ordinary. His childhood was stained with instability. His parents had a strained and often violent relationship. Arguments filled the household. Discipline was harsh, and the warmth of parental love was distant. He was a child who craved attention but rarely found it. Instead, he grew up in the shadows, learning to live with fear and confusion. In his early years, people described him as shy and reserved, a boy who often kept to himself. Yet there were disturbing hints even then, signs that something inside him was broken or beginning to break. Teachers noticed his detachment from other children. He rarely played with classmates, preferring instead to drift off into his own world. As time went on, his odd behaviors became more pronounced and harder to ignore. The first signs of his inner torment appeared in his teenage years. Richard began showing a fascination with death and sickness. Unlike other children who feared illness, he seemed obsessed by it. He developed strange habits that unsettled those around him. He became convinced that he was physically ill, that something inside his body was failing. He believed his heart stopped beating at times, that his stomach was rotting, that his blood was drying up. These thoughts consumed him, pulling him further from reality. His delusions would intensify as he grew older, but even in those early years there was an eerie quality to the way he spoke, about himself and his body. Animals became his first victims. Like many future killers, he started with cruelty that went unnoticed by most. He would capture small creatures, torture them, and then kill them. Neighbors would later recall how cats, dogs, and rabbits disappeared in alarming numbers near his home. Richard was behind many of these vanishings. He dissected them and in some cases drank their blood, believing it gave him strength. These acts, which should have been warnings to those around him, were brushed aside as the strange behaviors of a troubled boy. But they were far more than that. They were practice for horrors yet to come. As Richard entered high school, his isolation only deepened. He struggled socially, often unable to form relationships with peers, especially with girls. He longed for intimacy but could never achieve it. His mental health continued to spiral, and he began experimenting with drugs and alcohol in an attempt to numb his inner chaos. But nothing worked. His paranoia grew. He complained constantly of feeling unwell, visiting doctors repeatedly, insisting he suffered from bizarre illnesses. Yet medical examinations revealed nothing. Still, he was certain something was killing him from the inside out. Convinced that his blood was disappearing, he obsessed over finding ways to replenish it. By his late teens and early 20s, Richard's behavior had become more disturbing. He believed that his body was being controlled by outside forces, that people were conspiring against him, that his blood and organs were deteriorating beyond repair. He withdrew from reality, slipping deeper into madness and paranoia. He began mixing together strange concoctions of raw animal organs, blending them with soda and drinking them in the belief that it would keep him alive. His obsession with blood had now become his survival, his addiction, his only focus on life. Family and friends watched his decline with a mix of fear and helplessness. His mother noticed his detachment, but insisted he did not need medical treatment. She downplayed his growing instability, and even when signs of psychosis were clear, She failed to take serious action. Instead, Richard was left to wander aimlessly, trapped in his own sick fantasies. His father had long struggled to discipline him, but even he underestimated the darkness inside Richard. The young man who once appeared as a quiet boy had transformed into someone dangerous, unpredictable, and completely detached from reality. By his early 20s, Richard's appearance reflected the torment within. His thin frame, his hollow eyes, his pale skin, all gave him the look of someone barely alive. His neighbors grew wary of him. They noticed his strange habits, his refusal to socialize, his bizarre obsession with killing and dismembering animals, and yet still no one intervened in a way that might have stopped the storm that was coming. Richard Trenton Chase had already built the foundation of his madness. Every delusion, every obsession, every twisted act of cruelty was preparing him for the moment when animals would no longer satisfy his hunger. When his warped belief system would drive him to seek human victims, believing that only their blood could save him from his imagined decay. And though Sacramento had no idea, the quiet, awkward boy they once ignored was about to become one of the most horrifying killers in American history. By the late 1970s, Chase's paranoia had reached a level where he was no longer able to separate fantasy from reality. His mind was consumed with the belief that his blood was turning into dust, and that his organs were collapsing inside his body. He wandered the streets of Sacramento, looking more like a ghost than a man. His frame was thin, his skin pale, his eyes empty, yet burning with a strange madness. He had lost touch with society, drifting further away from normal life and deeper into the grip of psychosis. The people who saw him described him as unsettling, someone they would avoid without knowing why. His appearance reflected the storm inside him. His crimes began with animals, but the hunger that consumed him was never satisfied. He believed that blood was the only medicine for his imaginary illness. At first, cats, dogs, and rabbits were enough. He killed them, drained them, and drank their blood, hoping to feel whole again. But no matter how much he consumed, his paranoia told him it was not enough. The more he indulged, the more he needed. It became a cycle of madness, feeding his delusions with acts of cruelty, until the idea of human blood began to take root in his mind. On December 29, 1977, Richard Chase took his first human life. He spotted 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, a man who had no connection to him, no reason to be a target. Ambrose was helping his wife carry groceries into their Sacramento home when out of nowhere, a shot rang out. Chase had fired randomly from his car, hitting Griffin and killing him in front of his family. For Sacramento, this was a tragedy, but for Chase, it was only the beginning. The act gave him a rush, a twisted sense of power and satisfaction that animal blood had never provided. He had tasted the act of killing a human, and his sickness whispered that this was the cure he needed. Just weeks later, his madness grew darker. He roamed neighborhoods searching for unlocked doors. Chase believed that an unlocked door was an invitation to enter. If a door was locked, he saw it as a sign that he was not welcome. This belief became the way he chose his victims. On January 23, 1978, he found his way to the home of Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old pregnant woman. She was alone when he forced himself inside. With chilling calmness, Chase shot her with a handgun, killing her instantly. But death was not the end of his act. It was the beginning. What followed shocked investigators who would later walk into the crime scene. Chase dragged Teresa's body into the bedroom, where he committed acts so grotesque they seemed beyond human comprehension. He mutilated her body with knives, he desecrated her corpse, and most disturbingly, he drank her blood. He believed it was medicine for his body, that it was keeping him alive. He even collected some of it in a container for later use. His mind had fully surrendered to the fantasy that human blood was the only way he could survive. When police discovered Teresa Wallen's body, the scene was one of horror. Investigators who had witnessed countless murders were shaken to their core by what they found. It was not just the brutality of the killing, but the ritualistic nature of the act. The way her body was left, the evidence of blood consumption. It revealed a killer who was not motivated by greed or revenge, but by something far more disturbing, an unshakable belief that he needed to consume life to keep his own. The murder of Teresa Wallen sent waves of fear through Sacramento. The community was already shaken by the random shooting of Ambrose Griffin. But this new crime was different. It was intimate, it was savage. It was filled with signs of ritual and obsession. People began locking their doors, double-checking their windows, and keeping a closer watch on their families. The idea that someone was roaming the streets, searching for victims at random, created a sense of terror that gripped the city. Everyone feared that they could be next because Chase had no pattern. His victims were chosen not by connection, but by opportunity and chance. Despite the horror, Chase remained calm in his delusions. He did not flee, he did not hide. He believed firmly that what he was doing was necessary, that his life depended on it. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a man fighting for survival. His sickness convinced him that every act of violence was justified, because it was keeping him alive. This dangerous mindset was what made him so unpredictable. He was not killing for money or anger. He was killing because in his mind, it was the only way to live. The investigators struggled to make sense of the murders. The randomness made it difficult to predict his next move. They only knew that whoever was responsible had crossed a line from which there was no return. Animal blood was no longer enough. The killer had discovered human victims, and the hunger would only grow stronger with each act. As Sacramento lived in fear, Chase drifted further into madness. His crimes were escalating, and the city had only seen the beginning of what he was capable of. His sickness was feeding itself, growing with every drop of blood he consumed, his paranoia whispering that if he stopped, his body would wither and die. And so he prepared himself for what would come next. A spree that would plunge Sacramento into a nightmare of violence unlike anything it had ever seen. As the days turned into weeks, Richard Chase's descent into madness accelerated, and what had begun as paranoia and fear transformed into something far more disturbing. He became convinced that his blood was turning to powder, that his body was disintegrating from the inside out, and to him the only solution was to replenish himself with the life force of others. It was a delusion that would drive him to commit acts so horrific that they would forever brand him as one of America's most infamous killers. Chase began capturing and killing small animals, rabbits, dogs, even cats. He would drink their blood, often dissecting them, believing this was the only way to survive. But soon the animals were not enough to quiet the storm in his mind. He needed more, and his dark obsession grew stronger with every passing day. His neighbors began noticing strange things, pets going missing, odd smells coming from his apartment, Chase's appearance becoming more haggard and frightening. He walked the streets with bloodstains on his clothes, muttering to himself. A gaunt figure haunted by delusions, people avoided him, but no one could have imagined just how far his sickness would take him. In his twisted perception, he believed that the Nazis were after him, that secret organizations were controlling him, that his only way to fight back was to drink blood. Blood was his shield, his cure, his obsession. His neighbors did not yet realize that this quiet, strange man would soon turn his madness toward human beings. The line between fantasy and reality shattered completely, leaving only darkness in its place. One cold day in 1977, Chase made his first move beyond animals. His target was a man named Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer and family man who was simply helping his wife bring in groceries. With no warning, no reason, Chase drove by and randomly fired a gun, striking Griffin fatally. It was a senseless act, a test, a beginning of the blood-soaked rampage that was to come. Police were baffled. There was no motive, no connection, just a sudden and brutal killing. But for Chase, it was only the first taste of what his delusions demanded. In his diseased mind, Ambrose Griffin was not just a man, he was a vessel, His death meant survival for Chase, and it gave him the confidence to go further. His addiction to blood, his compulsion, was no longer something he could restrain. The hunger consumed him. Chase's apartment was a reflection of his mind. Filthy, blood-stained, littered with dead animals, organs stored in containers, blood smeared across walls, the stench unbearable. His refrigerator filled with grotesque trophies of his obsession. He no longer hid his sickness, because in his mind, this was not sickness at all. It was survival. It was necessity. And when he looked in the mirror, he didn't see a killer. He saw a man desperately fighting to stay alive. But the city of Sacramento was about to discover the true horror lurking within this man. Because his thirst was growing, his madness spreading, and the fragile barrier that once kept human life safe from his delusions was gone. As Christmas passed and the new year approached, Richard Chase's hunger became uncontrollable. His twisted beliefs told him that only human blood could save him now. Animals could no longer satisfy his needs, and so his hunt began. Sacramento was unaware that a predator walked among them, a man whose appearance gave away the madness inside, yet whose desperation would drive him to the unthinkable. And for Richard Chase, the line had already been crossed. There was no going back. His first murder had given him a taste, but his true nightmare was only just beginning. Soon homes would be invaded, families torn apart, and innocent lives stolen in ways too brutal to comprehend. And in Chase's mind, each act was justified, each killing necessary, because he believed his very survival depended on the blood of others. It was a belief that would plunge Sacramento into terror, and etch his name forever in the history of true crime as the Vampire of Sacramento, a man whose sickness became a storm that no one could stop, and whose shadow would haunt the city long after the blood had dried. Richard Trenton Chase's spree of terror was coming to its terrifying climax. Sacramento was gripped with fear as the vampire killer roamed its streets with no remorse and no pattern. His delusions had consumed him entirely, and every moment of his waking life was driven by the need to drink human blood. He became bolder with each passing day, breaking into homes without hesitation and killing with a cold precision that terrified investigators and civilians alike. The city had never seen anything like it, and the memory of his earlier crimes had already left families on edge and streets deserted at night. Chase's mind worked in loops of madness. He saw himself as a predator, but also as a man fighting for survival. He believed that his only chance to live was to take the life force from others, each act of violence feeding his delusions and reinforcing his warped sense of reality. On January 27, 1978, Chase's obsession escalated into one of the most brutal attacks in Sacramento's history. He entered the Miroth family home, where Evelyn Miroth, her 6-year-old son Jason, her young nephew David, and family friend Dan Meredith were present. The attack was sudden and horrifying. Chase shot Dan Meredith first, then turned on the children and Evelyn in a frenzy of violence that left the entire household dead. The acts were beyond comprehension. Investigators described it as ritualistic, savage, and driven entirely by the killer's obsession with blood. He mutilated the bodies, drank blood, and left the scene in chaos. The brutality marked a turning point in the investigation, and in the city's collective consciousness, showing the depths of evil that could emerge from one man consumed by madness. The discovery of the Miroth family massacre sent shockwaves through Sacramento and the surrounding areas. Parents kept their children inside. Doors were bolted, and windows locked even in broad daylight. The sense of dread hung over neighborhoods. Chase's unpredictability made him even more terrifying, because anyone could be a target. His method of choosing unlocked doors as invitations meant that no one was safe, and the randomness of his attacks left residents paralyzed with fear. Every family wondered if they would be next, and every officer on the case felt the urgency of stopping him before he could kill again. Investigators struggled to anticipate his next move, because his crimes were not motivated by revenge, jealousy, or monetary gain. They were fueled by delusions and an insatiable need that seemed impossible to understand or contain. Police began to gather evidence from his previous crimes and from neighbors' accounts. A picture emerged of a man deeply disturbed, living among them without anyone fully realizing the danger he posed. His apartment was eventually discovered to be a scene of horror. Walls smeared with blood, containers of human and animal remains stored meticulously, and cups of coagulated blood lined the shelves. Chase had created a macabre shrine to his delusions, and it became clear that his madness had reached its peak. Law enforcement realized the urgency of capturing him alive, but his behavior indicated he might resist violently. He was erratic, unpredictable, and completely detached from reality. Every day that passed increased the likelihood of further tragedy. As investigators prepared to apprehend him, Chase's paranoia grew stronger. He became increasingly suspicious of those around him and of his environment. He spoke of conspiracies, of forces trying to kill him, and of the necessity of consuming blood to survive. His mental state deteriorated, and he appeared more gaunt and hollow-eyed with each passing hour. Sacramento was on edge, and the media began covering the killings widely, spreading fear throughout the region. The public's fascination and terror grew with each new report of Chase's actions. People wondered how such a man could live among them unnoticed for so long, and what drove him to commit acts so horrifying. It was not just the killings themselves, but the ritualized consumption of blood that made him infamous. Finally, authorities moved in and arrested Chase in his apartment. The scene they encountered confirmed all their worst fears. Blood smeared on the walls, body parts stored in containers, and the smell of decay pervading the air. He offered no resistance, his eyes blank, almost as if he did not understand the gravity of his actions, or perhaps he was completely disconnected from reality. He was taken into custody and charged with 6 counts of murder. As the trial progressed, psychiatric evaluations revealed a man suffering from severe psychosis, paranoid schizophrenia, and delusions that had driven him to commit horrific acts. He was sentenced to death, but before the sentence could be carried out, he took his own life in prison in 1980, consuming an overdose of antidepressants, ending the life of a man whose insanity had terrorized an entire city. The story of Richard Trenton Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento, stands as one of the most chilling cases in American criminal history. His crimes were not born out of greed or anger, but of a mind utterly consumed by delusions and obsession with blood. He left behind a legacy of horror, a reminder of how fragile sanity can be, and how darkness can flourish unchecked. His name remains infamous, a cautionary tale, and a stark example of a killer whose insanity manifested in the most violent and disturbing way possible. His actions shocked a city, traumatized families, and left an indelible mark on the annals of true crime in America, ensuring that the memory of the Vampire of Sacramento will never be forgotten.